Magic the Gathering is a complex game with an expansive library of cards. Through the decades, we've seen thousands upon thousands of them, and naturally, some cards simply rise above others. Some cards rise too quickly. Others rise to such heights that they become ubiquitous, woven into the fabric of the game itself. We're here to discuss those cards and take a snapshot of a different time where cards that may look mundane today were absolutely backbreaking to the formats of old. I'd like to start this series by talking about a card that may look pedestrian, but one small feature made it an absolute terror in the modern format. Today, let's talk about Gitaxian Probe. For those who are unfamiliar, Gitaxian Probe is an instant that costs 1 blue Phyrexian mana. It reads, look at target player's hand, draw a card. Newer players may not understand the power of the effects on this basic looking card. After all, Peak is effectively the same card, and it sees no competitive play. However, Gitaxian Probe was a key piece of several game-breaking strategies in 2015 and 2016. Phyrexian mana was the marquee mechanic introduced in the new Phyrexia set, released on May 13, 2011. The premise was simple. If a card had a Phyrexian mana symbol in the cost could either be paid with the requisite colored mana or by paying 2 life, ignoring any color requirements. Immediately, there is a problem with this mechanic. If a card has only Phyrexian mana in its color requirement, which many of them did, by paying some of your life, you could play these cards for no mana cost. A fundamental part of Magic is the speed at which the game ramps up. The game is balanced around the cycle of tapped and untapped lands, so anytime a card can be played for no mana, it should be closely monitored. Because this card's cost can be 0 mana and 2 life instead of 1 mana, a hand of Gitaxian Probe and 6 random cards is almost always better than a hand of 7 random cards. The Gitaxian Probe hand can extend the available plays on your first turn, or the turn you draw it. It can effectively give you a free mulligan because Gitaxian Probe draws a card. It informs your first turn decisions as you can see your opponent's hand. It lowers your life total, and it puts a card in your graveyard. All of that will be important later on. In 2015 and 2016, a different mulligan rule was in place, called the Vancouver Mulligan. In a Vancouver Mulligan, if a player decided to mulligan their hand, they shuffled their hand back into the deck like normal and drew a new hand, subtracting 1 card for each time they mulliganed, redrawing 6 cards, then 5, and so on. Once a player decided to keep their hand, if they mulliganed, the player was allowed to scry 1 card. Gitaxian Probe thrived in this environment, as seeing 1 in your hand allowed you to effectively get a free scry and see an 8-card opening hand. Once you played Probe, you could then play out your turn normally, with the added benefit of having seen what threats to prepare for and have the ability to effectively feint and draw out your opponent's removal. It turns Magic from a mix of chess and poker into a game of Battleship where you can see both boards. The deck that best exemplified these principles of Gitaxian Probe would be Blue-Green Infect, popularized in 2015 by players like Brian Brownduin. The deck worked by playing 1 and 2 mana Infect creatures, green pump spells such as Groundswell and Mutagenic Growth, and blue accelerants, namely Gitaxian Probe. Infect was, and still is, an extremely aggressive deck, which requires a few key cards to stick around in order to win games. This made matchups like Modern Jund quite difficult, as Infect creatures will be easily removed by Jund's host of removal options, and Infect creatures don't trade well against mid-range creatures like Tarmogoyf. Gitaxian Probe helped matchups against Jund and blue-white control become a lot more favorable, as revealing your opponent's hand helped decide if your Infect creature would survive, or if your pump spell would stick, plus drawing a card would aid you in sculpting a better hand. The third hidden benefit of Probe is its role in filling the graveyard. A key component of blue-green Infect decks in this era was Become Immense, a devastating pump spell that costs a massive 6 mana. It had one saving grace, however. the Delve mechanic. Delve allowed you to exile cards from your graveyard in lieu of one generic mana. In short, a player could possibly pay just 1 green mana and exile 5 cards from their graveyard to give a creature +6/+6 until end of turn. In this era, the Infect deck wanted to achieve a 5-card graveyard as early as possible, ideally by turn 2 or 3, in order to fire off a Become Immense in addition to another pump spell, in order to generate 10 Infect in one attack. Gitaxian Probe was an ideal graveyard filler card because it could be played for 0 mana. On the first turn, Infect players could potentially have 3 cards in the graveyard by playing a Misty Rainforest, playing Gitaxian Probe by paying 2 life, and then playing either a Serum Visions or holding up Spell Pierce to counter their opponent's first turn play. If you revealed the opponent's hand and saw cards like Thoughtseize, but no removal, you know it is safe to play out your threat so that it doesn't get discarded. On the other hand, if you reveal the opponent's hand and saw removal such as Lightning Bolt, it's probably correct to hold your threat until you can safely deploy it with protection later on. Gitaxian Probe allowed Infect to confidently stand up to traditionally bad matchups and allowed it to flourish in the meta at the time. Blue-Green Infect was one of the most played decks during this era, earning a 10% share of Modern Top 8 finishes, according to MTG Top 8. In Modern, decks are often considered oppressive if they reach this high of a percentage. The most egregious examples are games where the Infect player was able to win as early as turn 2 despite an opponent's turn 1 Thoughtseize. Blue-Green Infect alone was not enough to earn Gitaxian Probe a spot on the ban list. The final straw was a deck called Suicide Zoo, the forerunner to the rampant Death Shadow archetypes that exist in today's modern metagame. Suicide Zoo first started making the rounds in June of 2015, popularized by players like Fabrizio Anteri. A classic Suicide Zoo deck list is shown here. The deck was a traditional zoo shell, playing cards like Wild Nacatl, Curd Ape, and Monastery Swiftspear. The deck was made more consistent by playing massive numbers of accelerants, such as Mishra's Bauble, Street Wraith, and Gitaxian Probe. Suicide Zoo's main strategy was to lower your own life total by playing fetch lands, Thoughtseize, and other life-taxing effects. After reaching 12 life or lower, the goal was to play Death Shadow, at the time an ancient bulk rare from Worldwake, which gained more power the lower your life total was. When attacking with the Death Shadow, you wanted to pair it with a Temur Battle Rage, granting lethal damage with Double Strike and Trample. Suicide Zoo was often referred to as a 48-card deck because it played so many accelerants. Accelerants are cards that allow a player to draw a card, which is commonly referred to as replacing itself. The best accelerants are often cheap, 1 or 0 mana. Suicide Zoo was brimming with 0 mana accelerants, meaning that the hand you keep could be vastly changed based on the number of those 0 mana accelerants. It was not uncommon to pitch 3 or 4 cards from your opening hand, filling the graveyard and paying life all the while, virtually guaranteeing an ideal hand for the inevitable turn 2 Death Shadow and then Temur Battle Rage. The amount of free draw also allowed Suicide Zoo to run an absurdly low land count of 16, while still consistently having enough mana to survive in Modern. This exposed the most fatal flaw of Gitaxian Probe and all Phyrexian mana cards. By simply paying 2 life, players could play these cards in any deck, without regard to their color identity. In Suicide Zoo, Gitaxian Probe was the only blue card in the entire deck. Eventually, players began to realize how powerful their decks could be if they simply replaced their 4 weakest cards with 4 Gitaxian Probes. The added consistency of playing a 56-card deck, coupled with the knowledge granted from the opponent revealing their hand, made this card a force to be reckoned with. As a result of Infect's success and the growing number of players adding a playset of Gitaxian Probe to their deck simply to eke out every bit of consistency and value that they could, Gitaxian Probe was banned on January 9th, 2017. Wizards of the Coast's statement on the card's banning was as follows. Gitaxian Probe increased the number of third-turn kills in a few ways, but particularly by giving perfect information and a card to decks that often have to make strategic decisions about going all in. This hurt the ability of reactive decks to effectively bluff, or for the aggressive deck to missequence their turn. Ultimately, the card did too much for too little cost. After Gitaxian Probe's ban, players began to shift away from Infect, as without the information acquired from it, they could not consistently be prepared for interaction or disruption from opponents. Their delve cards became weaker, and their decks became less consistent. Another strategy martyred by this ban was Suicide Zoo. The deck, as it was played in 2015 and 2016, ceased to exist, as Probe gave many of the same benefits to Suicide Zoo as it did to Infect. However, Gitaxian Probe's ban, in addition to a new understanding of the power of Death Shadow, led to innovations and discoveries that made the Death Shadow archetype what it is today. Gitaxian Probe's significance and dominance in the modern format had brought the validity and fairness of other Phyrexian mana cards into question. Is a card designed with the identity and flavor of a particular color in mind fair to play outside of that color? Some players say that cards such as Surgical Extraction or Dismember are perfectly fair, while others argue that every Phyrexian mana card should be banned, as the cards all, as Wizards proclaimed on Probe's ban statement, do too much for too little cost. For little to no mana investment, these cards give massive value and extend plays far beyond the normal bounds of the game. This simple, pedestrian common is, in my opinion, a perfect encapsulation of this idea, and that is why Gitaxian Probe is on the Magic the Gathering Modern ban list. Thank you for watching. This has been Dustin at Flak Magic. Have a good one.